Dr. Alessa Vren crouched low amidst the ruins of the medical outpost, her hands slick with the blood of a dying soldier. The acrid stench of scorched metal and charred flesh hung heavy in the air, a suffocating reminder of the orbital bombardment that had reduced this once thriving settlement to ash. Her movements were efficient, deliberate, her gloved fingers working swiftly to seal the soldier's wounds. Around her, chaos reigned, a cacophony of screams, plasma fire, and the guttural roars of alien marauders closing in on the battered survivors. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice firm but calm, as if sheer will alone could keep the man alive. His eyes fluttered open briefly, and he gave a weak nod before slipping into unconsciousness. She didn't have time to check if it was the peaceful kind or the permanent one. The shriek of incoming mortar fire forced her to dive for cover, dragging the soldier's limp body behind a crumbled wall. The explosion rattled her teeth, and a wave of heat washed over her, but she barely flinched. She'd been in worse situations where survival wasn't just improbable, but almost laughable. This wasn't one of those times. Not yet. A shadow loomed over her, impossibly tall and menacing. She turned, hand instinctively darting to the knife strapped to her thigh. But it was too late. A massive, scaled hand seized her by the collar and yanked her to her feet. Alessa found herself face to face with one of them, a Vorrak enforcer, its crimson eyes gleaming with sadistic glee beneath a horned helmet. Its jagged armor was splattered with the blood of those who had dared resist, and its grin revealed a mouth full of serrated teeth. "Human scum," it growled, its voice a guttural rasp. "You'll fetch a fine reward." Alessa didn't reply. She locked eyes with the alien, her expression carefully blank. The Vorrak mistook her silence for fear. It wasn't. Two more Vorrak emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on her. One barked an order in their guttural tongue, and Alessa was shoved forward, her captor's claws digging into her shoulder. She stumbled but didn't fall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. They marched her through the ruins, past the corpses of those she'd failed to save. Each step was a reminder of her helplessness, or so they thought. Alessa's mind was already working, cataloging her surroundings, assessing her captors, and calculating her odds. She had no intention of dying here. When they reached the landing zone, her heart sank, though her face betrayed nothing. A Vorrak transport ship loomed ahead, its sleek, insectoid design glinting in the firelight. Other prisoners were being herded aboard. Humans, mostly, their faces hollow with despair. Alessa was unceremoniously shoved up the ramp and into the ship's cold, metallic interior. The doors sealed shut with a hiss, plunging the hold into oppressive silence. The Vorrak guards barked orders, but Alessa ignored them. Her focus was on the other prisoners. They avoided her gaze, their spirits broken, their hope extinguished. She felt a pang of pity, but quickly pushed it aside. Pity wouldn't save them. The transport jolted as it lifted off, and Alessa braced herself against the wall. Her hands, bound in reinforced cuffs, itched to move, to act, but she forced herself to remain still. For now, observation was her weapon. Hours later, the ship landed with a bone-rattling thud. The prisoners were herded out, prodded by electrified batons. Alessa squinted against the harsh light of a desolate planet. The air was thick and heavy, tinged with the metallic tang of pollution. Looming ahead was a monolithic structure, its jagged towers piercing the smog-filled sky. The Vorrak guards shoved the prisoners toward the entrance, where a massive gate creaked open to reveal the infamous wolf cell. The stench hit her first, a rancid mix of sweat, blood, and decay. The interior was dimly lit, the walls scarred and blackened, as if even the stone itself had endured centuries of violence. The cells were cramped, their occupants a motley collection of alien species and humans. This was no ordinary prison. This was a crucible, a place where only the ruthless survived. The guards threw her into an empty cell, the doors slamming shut behind her. Alessa landed hard but rolled with the impact, rising to her feet in one fluid motion. Her cellmate, a hulking reptilian creature with scarred scales and cold, predatory eyes watched her from the shadows. "You won't last a day," it hissed, its voice dripping with contempt. Alessa didn't respond. She merely stared at the creature, her gaze steady, unflinching. It bared its teeth in what might have been a grin before retreating to the corner, apparently deciding she wasn't worth the effort yet. The hours bled together in the suffocating dark. The sounds of violence echoed from nearby cells, shouts, screams, the sickening crunch of bone. Alessa sat cross-legged on the floor, her mind racing. This wasn't just a prison, it was a death sentence. The Vorrak hadn't thrown her here for safekeeping. They'd thrown her here to die. But they had underestimated her. When the cell door creaked open again, and a guard barked an order, Alessa rose without hesitation. She was led into the central yard, where prisoners gathered in loose, hostile clusters. Eyes followed her every move, predatory, appraising, dismissive. A towering figure stepped forward, its voice booming over the din. "Fresh meat," it sneered. The leader of the dominant faction, Alessa guessed. Its armor was cobbled together from scavenged pieces, and its eyes gleamed with a dangerous mix of intelligence and malice. The crowd began to circle, eager for a show. The faction leader advanced, its massive fists flexing. "Let's see if you're worth keeping around." Alessa didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips that made the creature hesitate for the briefest of moments. It was all she needed. The first blow came fast, but Alessa was faster. She sidestepped, her movements fluid and precise, and drove her elbow into the creature's exposed ribs. It stumbled, snarling, and the crowd roared with a mix of surprise and excitement. Alessa didn't press the attack. She stepped back, her posture relaxed but ready, her eyes never leaving her opponent. She could feel the tension in the air, the way the crowd's perception of her was shifting. The faction leader growled, but didn't move to strike again. It wasn't a fool. It had seen enough to recognize that this wasn't an ordinary human, let alone a helpless medic. Alessa turned and walked away, leaving the leader seething in her wake. The crowd parted for her, their expressions a mix of wariness and newfound respect. As she returned to her cell, Alessa allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The Vorrak thought they had thrown a lamb into the wolf's den. They were wrong. The days that followed were a study in controlled chaos. The wolf cell was a seething pit of violence and desperation, its inhabitants locked in a perpetual dance of survival. Alessa moved through it like a shadow, observing, calculating, and carefully keeping her presence muted. She offered no unnecessary words, made no sudden moves, and avoided entanglements. Yet, her every action, no matter how subtle, was watched. The spectacle in the yard had marked her, and while most inmates maintained a wary distance, she could feel their curiosity pressing in from all sides. Her cellmate, the hulking reptilian known only as Karath, was the first to break the silence. One evening, as the artificial lights dimmed to simulate night, it spoke, its voice low and gravelly. "You're not just a medic." Alessa, seated on the edge of her bunk, didn't glance up. She was meticulously cleaning the jagged edge of a makeshift blade she'd scavenged from discarded machinery. "I never said I was," she replied evenly. Karath shifted in the shadows, its yellow eyes gleaming with muted curiosity. "You move like someone who's fought before. Someone who's killed." Alessa's hands stilled briefly before resuming their task. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just good at not dying." The creature snorted, a sound somewhere between amusement and skepticism. "You won't last long here if you keep playing coy." "Maybe," Alessa said again, her tone calm, detached. She wasn't ready to reveal anything. Not to Karath, not to anyone. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The next day, the Vorrak guards initiated one of their sadistic games, designed as both entertainment and population control. Alessa was pulled from her cell along with a dozen other prisoners, her hands bound behind her back. They were herded into the yard, where a makeshift arena had been constructed. The guards barked instructions in their guttural tongue, but the meaning was clear: fight or die. Alessa scanned the other prisoners, noting their varied reactions: fear, anger, resignation. Among them was a wiry human man, his gaunt face streaked with grime, and an insectoid alien with serrated limbs that twitched in anticipation. When the first match began, Alessa's suspicions about the Vorrak's cruel purpose were confirmed. The fights weren't about survival. They were about entertainment. The guards jeered and placed bets, their laughter echoing across the yard as prisoners tore into one another. When it was her turn, she was shoved into the center of the arena. Her opponent was the insectoid, its mandibles clicking hungrily as it advanced. Alessa stood still, her gaze steady, her body relaxed. The crowd leaned forward, sensing easy prey. The creature lunged, its serrated limbs slashing through the air. Alessa moved in a blur, sidestepping the attack and pivoting behind it. Her movements were precise, almost surgical, as she drove her elbow into the back of its head, sending it sprawling. The guards roared with laughter, delighted by the unexpected display. The insectoid scrambled to its feet, enraged, but Alessa was already moving. She ducked under its next strike, twisted, and delivered a sharp kick to its thorax. The sound of cracking chitin echoed through the yard. When the creature collapsed, unmoving, the guards signaled the match's end. Alessa stepped back, her chest rising and falling with measured breaths. She met the gaze of the crowd, her expression unreadable. If they wanted her to play their games, she would play, but on her terms. In the days that followed, her reputation grew. Word of her victory spread, and prisoners began to approach her, not out of camaraderie, but out of self-interest. A few offered alliances, hoping to benefit from her skills. Others sought to test her, probing for weaknesses. One such test came in the form of a direct challenge. The faction leader she had embarrassed in the yard finally decided to assert its dominance. It cornered her in the mess hall, its gang of followers forming a loose circle around them. "You've been making waves, human," it sneered, its voice low and threatening. "I don't like waves." Alessa regarded the creature with a calm that belied the tension in the air. "Then you should have stayed out of the water." The faction leader snarled and lunged. Alessa was ready. She sidestepped its clumsy attack, her movements fluid and deliberate. This wasn't the chaotic flailing of a desperate prisoner. This was the precision of someone who had trained for moments like this. The fight was over in seconds. Alessa struck with surgical efficiency, exploiting weaknesses she had observed in the leader's movements. When it crumpled to the floor, wheezing and clutching its side, she stepped back and looked around the circle of stunned faces. "I don't want your throne," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "But if anyone else feels the need to test me, don't bother pulling punches." "I won't." The crowd dispersed, and Alessa returned to her cell, her steps unhurried. Karath was waiting, its expression unreadable. "You're making enemies," it rumbled. "I'm making points," Alessa corrected. She sat on her bunk, her posture deceptively relaxed. "Points that'll keep us alive a little longer." Karath studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Fair enough. But they're still going to come for you." "They always do," Alessa murmured, almost to herself. As the days passed, a shift began to take place within the cell. Alessa's presence, once regarded with suspicion, began to inspire a tentative sense of order. She patched up wounded prisoners when she could, earning reluctant gratitude. She mediated disputes with a quiet authority that left even the most violent inmates wary of challenging her. The Vorrak guards took notice. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their usual jeers replaced by whispered conversations. Alessa saw it in their eyes. They were beginning to realize they'd made a mistake. But it was too late for them to correct it. One night, as the lights dimmed and the cell block settled into uneasy silence, Alessa sat cross-legged on the floor, her mind racing. She knew the status quo couldn't last. The Vorrak thrived on chaos, and they wouldn't tolerate a prisoner disrupting their carefully curated anarchy. She glanced at Karath, who was watching her from its corner. "When the time comes," she said softly, "are you in?" The reptilian creature tilted its head, considering her words. Finally, it nodded. "You have a plan?" "I'm working on one," Alessa replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. The Vorrak had thrown her into the wolf cell to die, confident that she was just another broken human. They hadn't realized their mistake. But they would. The alarm blared, its sharp, grating sound cutting through the thick tension of the prison. Alessa stood in the shadows of her cell, her back pressed against the cold, rough wall, her eyes locked on the flickering lights beyond the bars. The air was thick with anticipation, every prisoner on edge, their whispers like the faint rustle of leaves before a storm. She felt the weight of the moment settle over her, a tangible pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. They had begun to suspect her. She'd seen it in the Vorrak guards' lingering stares, in the way their hands hovered too close to their weapons when they passed her. The fights, the subtle alliances, her growing influence. It had all been enough to tip them off. Alessa hadn't needed confirmation, but when two guards arrived unannounced earlier that day, dragging a screaming prisoner out of the yard, she knew her time was up. They were closing in, and if she didn't move now, she'd lose the slim advantage she'd built. Karath shifted beside her, the low rumble of its breathing steady but tense. It had become her unlikely ally, a brute force counterbalance to her calculated precision. They had exchanged few words since making their unspoken pact, but Alessa had come to rely on its instincts, its understanding of the unwritten rules that govern this place. "They'll come for you first," Karath said quietly, its deep voice barely audible over the alarm. "I know." Alessa's gaze didn't waver from the corridor beyond their cell. She had already mapped the guards' rotation schedules, memorized the blind spots in their patrols. All that remained was timing, and the nerve to act when the moment arrived. The lights flickered again, then dimmed completely. The alarm was silenced, replaced by an oppressive, eerie stillness. Alessa tensed, her grip tightening on the jagged blade concealed in her sleeve. This wasn't part of the usual routine. From somewhere deep within the prison, a guttural roar echoed, a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. Karath stiffened, its eyes narrowing. "Someone triggered a lockdown," it growled. "That's not just a lockdown," Alessa murmured. She stepped closer to the bars, peering into the gloom. Shadows moved in the distance, quick, purposeful. Vorrak guards, but not the usual patrol. These were different. Heavily armed, their movements disciplined, their postures radiating lethal intent. Karath followed her gaze, its claws flexing. "Special operatives. They're not here for crowd control." "No," Alessa agreed, her voice cold and steady. "They're here for me." The realization didn't spark fear. It ignited something far more dangerous, an iron resolve that had carried her through worse than this. She turned to Karath, her eyes hard. "Remember the plan," she said. Karath nodded once, a curt, almost reverent gesture. The cell door slid open with a metallic groan, and two operatives stepped inside. Their weapons were trained on her, the cold, sharp hum of their energy rifles filling the confined space. "Alessa Vren," one of them said, its voice filtered through the harsh distortion of a translator device. "You're coming with us?" Alessa tilted her head, a faint, almost amused smile touching her lips. "Am I?" The operative didn't respond. It gestured with its weapon, and Alessa stepped forward slowly, her movements deliberate. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained calm, almost detached. The moment the second operative reached for her, she struck. Her blade flashed in the dim light, catching the Vorrak across its exposed neck. It stumbled back, gurgling, as blood sprayed across the cell's walls. Alessa pivoted, using the dying operative as a shield against the second's incoming fire. The energy blast sizzled through the air, narrowly missing her as she closed the distance. Karath exploded into motion, its massive form barreling into the second operative with bone-crushing force. The guard's weapon clattered to the floor as Karath's claws tore through its armor, silencing its struggle in seconds. Alessa didn't waste time. She grabbed the fallen weapon and stepped into the corridor, her sharp gaze darting between shadows. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the cell block, accompanied by the faint hum of more rifles. "They'll be on us any second," Karath rumbled, wiping blood from its claws. "Good," Alessa said, her voice cold and sharp. "Let them come." They moved through the twisting corridors with practiced efficiency, Alessa leading the way. She knew every turn, every choke point, every vulnerable spot in the prison's defenses. Each step was deliberate, each decision calculated. As they rounded a corner, they encountered another patrol. Energy blasts lit the air as Alessa and Karath engaged, their movements a deadly dance of precision and brute force. By the time the last guard fell, Alessa's pulse was racing, but her focus hadn't wavered. The control room was their destination, the heart of the prison's security systems. Reaching it was the key to everything, disabling the lockdown, opening the cells, and sparking the chaos they needed to escape. When they arrived, the room was heavily guarded, just as she'd expected. Alessa crouched behind cover, her mind racing as she analyzed the layout. "There's no way through without setting off the alarms," Karath muttered. "They're already coming for me," Alessa replied. "We use that to our advantage." Before Karath could respond, Alessa moved. She darted into the open, drawing the guard's fire as she weaved between cover. Her stolen rifle barked, taking down 2 guards before they could react. Karath followed, a force of nature tearing through the remaining guards with brutal efficiency. Together, they cleared the room, the air heavy with the scent of scorched metal and ozone. Alessa moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the interface. She bypassed the Vorrak encryption with ease, her years of experience in sabotage coming to the forefront. "There," she said as the lockdown released. Doors throughout the prison hissed open, and the roar of hundreds of freed prisoners filled the air. Karath glanced at her, its expression unreadable. "This isn't just about escape, is it?" Alessa met its gaze, her eyes cold and unyielding. "No, it's about sending a message." The Vorrak had made a mistake, throwing her into the wolf cell, believing they could break her. Now, they would learn the truth the hard way. As the prison descended into chaos, Alessa and Karath slipped away, their path clear. The galaxy thought her nothing more than a medic, a healer bound by oaths and morality. They were wrong.